Hello and good evening. This will be part two of a very special National Divorce Talk Raw with your host, Mark Ruiz Evans. In the first part of this series, we talked about how California could be the next United Nations and that it would do a better job than the current United Nations and that the world needed a new discussion center, something I had pointed out in my book, California's Next Century 2.0. The first part of this episode was called California Should Be the New UN. And basically what it talked about was when Russia invaded Ukraine, the West, America and Europe mostly, went on TV and went in the newspaper and told everybody, the world is with us against Russia. The world is with us against Russia. The world is united with us against Russia. And it appears as though they actually believed that. And then reality set in. They tried to get Russia banned from the Human Rights Council on the United Nations. They thought that was going to be a slam dunk vote, and it was not. About half of the world sided with America and the rest of the West, and about half of the world did not side with America and the rest of the West. And that's why you're seeing a lot of articles talking about who are the countries backing Russia and why. It was because Americans and Europeans believed they are the West, and that when Russia invaded Ukraine, everybody saw the same thing exactly like they did, and everybody agreed with their conclusions. And then they went to the United Nations and actually asked everybody on the world stage, and they found out half the planet does not agree with them. And I use that not as a way of criticizing the UN or saying that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was good. Of course it wasn't. But I used it to point out something that I had pointed out in 2012 with my book, California's Next Century, which is that there needs to be a new UN. There needs to be a new discussion center. A lot of the institutions created after World War II in the aftermath of the crumbled and burning ash core Europe, Russia, and most of Asia, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, and all of its associated projects were created by America and Europe, mostly for the benefit of America and Europe. Now, America and Europe say those things were done for the benefit of everybody and not just us, and they benefit everybody and not just us, and their world rule system. International rules-based order will be the phrase that you hear, championed by Europe and America mostly. And what they're saying is that's for everybody. Well, this is part two of most of the world doesn't buy it. If you watch part one, you're going to see how most of the world, at least half of it, isn't buying it. And they don't believe what Western countries say. And they don't really believe that the United Nations is fair to them or the international rules-based order is fair to them. That's why they're not holding it up. And that's why they're not coming to the same statements that Europe and America do on things like Ukraine or climate change or many other things, because they don't view these institutions as fair partners. Because these institutions are not fair partners, it means there needs to be a new center for discussion. And I argued that should be California, because California has Chinese people in it, had it for about 100 years. It's had Russian people in it, had that for about 100 years. We have Fort Ross. The Chinese premier Xi Jinping came to California because he knew so many Chinese people were here. We're connected to Latin America. We have a lot of Europeans here and a lot of Americans. We have a lot of European tourists, especially in LA and the Bay Area, and a lot of European embassies. And then we're crawling with Americans. And then we got lots of Latin Americans. And then India. The entire country of India knows that their tech sector is based out of California. So California has a special heart in the minds of Russians because of Fort Ross and because there's so many Russians here. And because Glasnost, the end of the Cold War, was started by a bunch of Californians, not Americans. China knows about California because there's so many Chinese people here, way more than anywhere else, and they're very rich. And it's so much on the radar that the premier of China came here. India knows about California because their Silicon Valley is attached to Bangalore in India and the entire tech sector, the country which is a major driver of their economy, and the reason why they were able to move into the Western order. Brazil is Latin, and we got a lot of Latin people, a lot of Americans, a lot of Europeans. So that means we have all of the major powers and regions of the earth here in California. And that's exactly what Switzerland had when it started the idea of the UN about a century ago. The first name of the UN was the League of Nations, and it failed. But the UN was basically a retried version of that. And the League of Nations started in Switzerland. It was built by the Swiss, and nobody thought it could be anywhere but Switzerland because the Swiss were part German, French, Italian, and Romansh. And then they picked up English, which meant they spoke most of the languages of all the major world powers at that time. And California could fill that role now. I want to spend today's show covering how most of the world does not believe in the traditional negotiation centers. They're not buying it, and there needs to be a new one, which could be California. This is kind of an update. Part one of this video and part two are basically updates to my book, California's Next Century 2.0, written 10 years ago, where I predicted 10 years ago that the world order would break down into competing poles and that America was not admired and not followed and not looked up to, and it couldn't boss people around like it wanted to, and new powers were emerging who were going to test its power, and the idea that the UN would just back America wasn't true because, along with the IMF and the World Bank and all these international institutions, because they're not seen as fair arbiters for most of the planet. And this last month, everything I predicted in 2012 has come true. That's why I keep focusing on Russia invaded Ukraine. The West said the world is with them. Then the West put it up to vote in the UN and found out only half the world's with them and the other half isn't. That's exactly what I predicted in my book, California's Next Century 2.0, in 2012, originally published, self-published 2011 before it's officially published. So I said there's going to be a break of the discussion centers because they're not seen as fair. And that's going to cause chaos and potentially war. And I said that in 2012. Well, this month in 2020, it's all playing out. April, May. Basically, the month of April 2020 is playing out everything that I predicted in 2012. Let's get to the data. That's what this show's all about. We're going to cover the data on why there should be a new UN. Well, the major reason is that these institutions aren't fair. For example, that's the International Monetary Fund is a source of world negotiations. So this is part of the rules-based order that the West always talks about. It includes the International Monetary Fund. Well, the International Monetary Fund includes, most of the fund is owned by the US, Britain, Germany, and France and Japan, the West. And then there's also China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. So the majority of the International Monetary Fund is the West. Hence, it's not fair. And the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank are global institutions. Both are still under the control of Western countries. Here's the International Monetary Fund, who has more Western members than non-Western members and a controlling percentage of the budget. Now we'll talk about the International Monetary Fund. I'm sorry. Yeah, this is all the International Monetary Fund. The president is usually European, while the president of the World Bank is an American. So if you're not an American or a European, you're never going to be leader of the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, which are supposed to be institutions for everybody. The majority of the IMF funding comes from the West. That's what this is pointing out. And basically, the conclusion is this. The IMF and the World Bank equals no leadership from India, no leadership from Brazil, no leadership from Latin America, no leadership from Africa, no leadership from China, and no leadership from Russia. There's never a Russian or Chinese president ever. Now, China and Russia do get to be part of the fund of the International Monetary Fund, but China, Russia, Brazil, Latin America, India, Africa, never going to be leader and never have been leader or president of the IMF or World Bank for the decades those places have been in charge. And most of the funding of the IMF is by the West, not non-West. Now, here's another one. The United Nations is the key center global institution. Well, there's nobody from India, nobody from Brazil, nobody from Latin America, and nobody from Africa in this UN Security Council. The UN Security Council includes Germany, France, England, The UN Security Council includes America, Germany, England, France, China, and Russia. It does not include India, Brazil, anyone from Latin America, or anyone from Africa. And the UN Security Council can stop anything from happening in the UN. There's the General Assembly of the UN, which includes everybody, and they can vote on things. But nothing becomes law or enacted as an action of the UN unless the Security Council approves it, which means you got to get France, England, America, China, and Russia to buy off on it. And basically India, Brazil, anyone from Latin America, and anyone from Africa never actually gets to be in the driver's seat or at the final decision-making table by the UN ever. Additionally, 78% of the UN budget is controlled by the West. Just like the International Monetary Fund is majority controlled monetarily wise by the West, the majority of the UN budget is by the West. That does not breathe confidence to the Chinese, Indians, Russians, or Latin Americans that the UN is a fair and neutral arbiter of international discussion. Additionally, when we look at the UN, there's never been a UN president from Russia or China or India. Well, actually, India had a UN president in 1953 and Brazil had one in 1947, 70 years ago. And there's never been a Russian or Chinese president of the United Nations, ever. But it's supposed to be for everybody. So basically, in the last 70 years, Russia, China, India, Brazil have never had a presidency. And those are major superpowers, and they were never included in the presidency of the UN over the last 70 years. But they're supposed to be for everybody. And here you go. Here's the International Criminal Court, another part of the international rules-based order. And it relies on the cooperation of member states, including those the court may one day have to prosecute. It is also closely tied to the UN. Security Council, which includes Russia, China, the United States. 3 of the permanent veto-wielding members of the UNSC still have refused to join the ICC, and they can decide if the court can investigate atrocities by non-court signatories. This poses a legitimacy problem for an ostensibly global court and raises questions over its capability. So the International Criminal Court can't prosecute anybody unless the UN Security Council says they can. And the UN Security Council doesn't include anybody from India or Brazil or anyone from Latin America or anyone from Africa. So this international rules-based order court system doesn't include anybody from India, Brazil, Latin America, or Africa, and yet they're able to decide who gets to be prosecuted and have a sense of international justice. So no Indian, no Brazilian, no Latin American, no African power over the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court president has never been a Russian, Indian, Chinese person before, and it was a Brazilian before, but not for the last 10 years. So there's never been a Russian, Indian, Chinese president of the International Criminal Court, which is supposed to be for everybody. And basically that's the point, is that the world discussion forums don't work like they used to. That was the point. They're basically seen as biased. And this is what I was talking about that got it all going. The West told itself that everyone was with it against Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And then reality set in when it actually tried to hold a world vote on banning Russia from a UN Human Rights Council. 93 countries were for this, and 82 countries were either against it or did not support the ban against Russia, of a total of 175 countries. So 93 countries said, let's kick Russia out of the UN Human Rights Council. And 82 countries said, I either don't agree with that or I don't want to support that, out of 175, which means only 53% of the nations of the world were for the ban. Now, what you're going to hear in the newspaper is that a majority of nations sided against Russia. True. A majority of nations did side against Russia. What you're never going to see is that it was 53%. There's the math right there. This isn't hard to do. They'll print 93 for. They won't say 82 against. They'll put 93 for, 20 abstained, and then 50 said no, or 50 abstained and 20 said no. They'll never put 93 versus 82. You won't see that anywhere in the news. And they'll never put that. That basically means they got a passing vote of nations. So out of 175 nations, they got 53% to vote against Russia. Barely over half. Not going to see that anywhere. Now, this is a quote from Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is a guy who basically devised American foreign policy through Kennedy, Nixon, Reagan, Bush. He's still consulted now. So basically, Kissinger was the top foreign policy scholar in America and helped direct a lot of the thinking about how America deals with foreign nations and superpowers since the 1960s till now. And he has this quote: "What passes for order in our time was devised in Western Europe nearly 4 centuries ago at a peace conference in the German region of Westphalia, conducted without the involvement or even the awareness of most other continents or civilizations." Henry Kissinger. And that's the point. Kissinger himself is saying, when we look at this international rules-based order, its start was in Europe, and the Europeans did not coordinate with the rest of the world. And then when we look at how fair is this group? Well, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is majority funded by the West. The IMF president is always a European, and the World Bank president is always an American and no one else. That means the West. Nobody from India, Brazil, nobody from Latin America, Africa, China, Russia ever gets to be president of these financial institutions that represent the global concern over money. When we look at the UN Security Council, they can turn down any vote or resolution the UN Security Council wants to do. You have to get the Security Council members to approve it before the UN can do anything. And nobody from India, Brazil, anyone from Latin America, and nobody from Africa is on that Security Council. So they're participating in the UN, but nobody from these regions, which represents 3/4 of the planet, ever gets to be in charge. 78% of the UN budget is controlled by the West, just like the IMF budget. The UN president, well, there was one in India in 53 and Brazil in 47, but basically in the last 40 years, there's never been anybody from Russia, China, India, or Brazil who's been a president. And we look at the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So we looked at the IMF and the World Bank money. Then we looked at the UN, which is law. And then we looked at the International Criminal Court, which is justice. International Criminal Court can't do anything without the UN Security Council. So these countries, Russia and China and the United States, who are not even part of the International Criminal Court, get to decide who gets to be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. So Russia, China, and the United States are not part of the International Criminal Court, so they can't be charged. But because they're Security Council members, they get to decide who gets to be prosecuted by the ICC. And the ICC, no Indian, no Brazilian, no Latin American, and no African person is in power over the court. The ICC president has never been a Russian, Indian, Chinese person, and there was a Brazilian person, but not for 10 years. And basically, we're starting to see the breakdown of the World Discussion Center. And the big showcase was when they tried to ban Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, and they only got 53% of the nations behind them. And the reason is that the International Criminal Court is not seen as fair. The UN presidency is not seen as fair. The UN budget is not seen as fair. The UN Security Council system is not seen as fair. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank presidency is not seen as fair. The funding for the IMF is not seen as fair. And that's why they don't buy what the West is saying or side with the West, because they don't buy these institutions. Hence why we need new institutions. Okay, that's the point. I'm going to show you the evidence. Here we go. Walk you through this relatively quick. So this is the article, Why Do Some Countries Stand with Russia? See, 93, 2/3 voted in favor. That's what they're saying. That's not true. So 93 versus 58 plus 24. 58 plus 24 is 68, 72. 72. So it's about, I might have been off about on the 53%. Maybe it's around 60%. But basically, 78. No, I'm right. 82%, 82 versus 93. So as you can see, they won't say 82 versus 93. They'll say 2/3 are in favor. And what they're doing is they're comparing the countries who supported the resolution against the countries who voted against. But 58 countries abstained because they didn't want to go against Russia. So if you add all the countries who voted against and the countries that abstained, it's about 82 versus 93, which is about 53% of the world's nations supported this and roasted it. And again, here you go. Why do some countries stand with Russia? Here you go. You can see some countries are choosing to maintain their ties with Russia. The countries maintaining research ties with Russia. Why so much of the world won't stand up to Russia? Here's where countries stand on Russia's. Why do Russian allies stand as Western power slams? Why do some countries stand friendly? Fact sheet, join my. So this vote happened. It freaked the West out. And then the West did, why are all these countries not siding with us on our point that we're sure we're right about? Here's another article from Amit Sengupta. He is out of India and he does a lot of news for India independently. And in this, he's talking about how Indian people can't exactly trust Western media outlets because they say exactly what the Western government wants. And so while you can't exactly trust Russian news, you can't trust Western news to be independent either. So this is a guy out of India. He does a lot of political analysis for India, 1.43 million subscribers. He's coming from an Indian perspective, which says, I mean, what Russia's doing is bad, but we can't trust Western media sources because they say whatever the government wants to, just like the Russian news says whatever their government wants to. That's how people in India view it. I'll show you a few more examples. Here you go. Disagreement over Russia. One scenario is where we have divided blocks that are not trading much with each other, that are on different standards, and that would be a disaster for the global economy. The economic counselor for the International Monetary Fund. And what he's talking about is there seems to be these two poles of power pulling everything apart, not coming into agreement, and that's really bad, and it could basically mean the breakdown of world order. So the G20 is another global discussion forum, and this is India News WION, 5.96 million subscribers. It's basically from India. It's the India perspective, and they're talking about how this other G20 meeting couldn't come to agreement, just like the UN.
And that would be a disaster for the global economy. In short, the walkouts in Washington will take the world a step closer to more economic troubles, something that the world cannot afford right now. We are now awaiting the warning. The chief economist has said arrive at a consensus now will set off a huge economic growth and prosperity. As I speak, the global economy is facing its biggest challenge in decades. The Wuhan virus pandemic has set off global inflation. The war in Ukraine has added to the soaring prices of the commodities. The G20's failure to cooperate or arrive at a consensus now will set off a new international order, one that is dictated by a fragmented global economy. Experts are prepared for this. The International Monetary Fund has already issued a warning. The chief economist has said, and I'm quoting, one scenario is one where we have divided.
So India is talking about how there's a lot of important international issues to come to, how to deal with the Ukraine-Russia crisis, how to deal with getting the economy back on, how to deal with COVID-19. And basically the UN had Western countries stage walkouts in order to protest Russia. And while maybe that's, Russia did is bad, the G20 has important issues to get done. And when half the members just walk out over politics, they can't get anything done. And then the whole world is looking at the G20 and going, great, you punished Russia, but what about food prices and oil prices and inflation and the next pandemic and this pandemic? Oh, yeah, bro, we'll get to that later, whenever. Well, that's not inspiring confidence in the rest of the planet that the G20 can't work with Russia and can't have meetings with all the major powers to come to world agreements on major decisions, but in rather will just bicker over a particular issue, however important it is, and not come to decisions. And they're going, wow, this isn't good when the G20 can't come together and get agreements from just 20 countries. The UN is a larger discussion forum of all the countries. The G20 is only 20 countries versus 175. It's 8 times smaller. So the G20 was designed to be smaller so that it could get decisions made by the leading countries and then get the UN and the rest of it to follow. And what they're saying is they can't even come together and come to an agreement now. By the way, this isn't the first time that people talked about the G20 is a failed institution. There's been numerous walkouts in the G20 and numerous times where they did not have an official communique at the end of the meeting, meaning that they came to an agreement on anything. So that's a bad sign for the world order falling apart, and this is India pointing that out.
We regret the lack of inclusivity in the manner this resolution was put forth. We have serious concerns about such take it or leave it initiatives which do not make a genuine effort to take into account the perspectives and concerns of the wider membership.
Take it or leave it sums up the P5's attitude to reforming the United Nations. They act like they own the place, as if reforms are some kind of charity. But the UN belongs to the entire international community.
So this is India saying, why are we part of the UN, and why should we as Indians view the UN as fair when the Security Council has Russia, China, England, France, and America, and they can just shut down anything. And they all use the UN for their own purposes and however they want. It's basically not fair. And the UN has a take it or leave it attitude. And India is a major superpower, and they're going, what is with this attitude of you do whatever we say, you don't get to be involved in you don't get to be involved in the decision-making process. Sorry, my words aren't with me today. And how is that fair to India? So this is a major Indian news. You just saw the Indian diplomat talking about this, and here's Indian news going, that's really not very fair. And here's India slammed the West back reform. So the West made a proposal to have countries say why they would veto legislation if they did. And India is saying, why should we really believe that the West is interested in real reform in the UN when we in India have been asking to sit on the Security Council for over a decade, and you've completely ignored us, even though we're a major power? And yet you won't give us buy-in, you won't let us be part of the process, but you expect us to just accept whatever reforms you say. And that's insulting to India. Here it is. The president of the IMF is usually a European, while the president of the World Bank is an American, just showing you that that's true. There's the International Monetary Fund. This comes from, I'll show you the source. International Monetary Fund, IMF functions, powers, and organization May 20th, 2020 by lawruling.com, functions, powers, and the IMF, basically showing it's controlled by Europe and America. Here's the Permanent Security Council members of the UN: China, France, Russia, United Kingdom, United States. And then all these countries don't get to be part of the UN Security Council. And basically these 5 countries here get to determine what the UN does, and they get to determine who gets to be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. But Russia is not on the International Criminal Court, so it can't be prosecuted. China is not in the ICC, so it can't be prosecuted. And the United States is also not on the ICC to be prosecuted. So these 3 countries can't be prosecuted, but they can choose who gets to be prosecuted. And every other country in the world, except for these 5, is at their mercy for what the UN does and who gets to actually be prosecuted by the ICC. This is the UN financing revenue by government donor for the UN. And there you go. Contributors: US, Germany, United Kingdom, Japan. There's China, and then it drops to Sweden, France, Canada, Norway, Italy, and then others. Basically, the West owns the majority of the funding of the UN, and then there's China. I made a little chart. I'll see if I can show that to you now. hoping that displays. So here's all the countries in yellow. I pulled out the major non-Western countries: China, India, Brazil, Russia, and then there's China. Yeah, China again. Now, if you add up all the Western countries, out of $42,303,768,903 for total UN funding, the total Western combination is $33,063,070, or 78% of the UN total. So majority of funding comes from the West, dominating the UN. Here's the presidents of the UN, as I was pointing out. There's Brazil once, 70 years ago. India once, 70 years ago. And then if you look at this, you'll never see Russia, China, India, or Brazil in the last 70 years. But those are major powers full of people, and they're supposed to support the international rules-based order, but they've never been able to be president of that organization, basically ever. So there you go. I'm just proving it to you. And here you go. This is on the ICC. They talk about how the ICC is biased against Africa because Africa doesn't get to be on the court, but many of the court cases against Africa are from the ICC. So a lot of Africans are getting arrested and investigated by the ICC, but they don't get to be president of the ICC ever. And they think that's unfair and it's biased against them. And it also relies on the cooperation of member states, including those closely tied Security Council, Russia, China, United States. 3 of those 5 veto-wielding members still have refused to join the ICC, and yet they can decide if the court can investigate atrocities committed by non-court signatories. This poses a legitimacy problem. There you go. That's from the United Nations, UK Action, Stronger World, etc. United Nations, the International Criminal Court, biased or simply misunderstood, published in 2018. So I have a few more sources to show you. Give me a second to load them up, and we'll go over that. Give me 1 second.
Governments, especially by the
One more minute, almost there. Okay. Sorry, there's a lot of material.
That the fact that both
Anyway, and almost 20 years later, the
41 to
UN has
46.
been proved right. No weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. Those are
Almost there. Sorry. It's going to be worth it, I promise.
Tonight, I want to start the show with these words by Henry Kissinger. He once said, "It may be dangerous to be America's in China." America's recent track record does
Okay, 1 second. Almost there. 2:30. Zero zero to 2:50.
This is our top story at this hour. The United States doublespeak stands exposed as a report by a
Okay, we're going to get on with part 2. I want to show you some additional references showing that most of the world does not view the international discussion centers, the IMF, the World Bank, the ICC, the UN, as fair. And that is a fair conclusion that they've come to because those institutions are not fair and inclusive to them while expecting them to do what they're told and say. Nobody would like that. And so we need a new discussion center, and I posit it could be California. But I wanted to show you that basically the world is not buying the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the ICC, and thinking that it's fair. And the problem with that is that when things like when Russia invades the Ukraine, and the West says, hey, world, come and back us on this issue, the world's like, nah, I don't, you guys weren't really fair. So I don't know if I'm going to support you. But these are our international discussion centers, and they decided, yeah, I kind of don't believe them anyways, and I think they're really rigged just to help you. And I kind of told you this, but you ignored me, and now when it's important, now you're starting to talk about it. How come you didn't ask or care about me being concerned about the fairness of these institutions before? How come you're only interested when you want something? I'm just going to show you some more evidence of how the rest of the world sees this. Here you go. This is just to show you the judges of the International Criminal Court. And as I pointed out, there you go. There's nobody from Russia or China or India or Brazil or really, I think Costa Rica and Mexico are on there. That's not a very good showing for Latin America. In Africa, what do we got? Benin, Uganda, Sierra Leone. That's 3 countries out of Africa and maybe 2 countries out of Latin America when there's like 30 in each continent. So not a very good showing. Okay, here we go. This is Chinese news, CGTN, and they are interviewing a Latino who covers Latin news. So this is not the Chinese government making this up. They're going, hey, we'll just talk to a guy who covers Latin American news, and we'll ask what this Latin American reporter who covers Latin American news thinks about the fairness of America and the Western order, and we'll let him talk to the Chinese people. Here you go.
That we have a wide scope of shows and a diverse range of guests since its inception 6 months ago. And today is no exception. Joining me in our program at this hour is Benjamin Norton. He's the founder and editor of the independent news website Multipolarista, where he does original reporting in both English and Spanish. He reported from numerous Latin American countries, and he was a former investigative journalist at the Gray Zone. Benjamin, great to have you with us. Welcome to CGTN.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure being here.
Benjamin, first of all, there's so many things I want to get to, but first of all, how would you describe the voice, the representation of the Global South in the global media and opinion landscape? Are you happy with the state of affairs now?
Well, clearly we see that in the Western media, there is a lot of bias, and the presentation of the Global South in the Western media is very propagandistic. So first of all, the Western media acts as though the Global South is largely irrelevant. I mean, when we're talking about the conflicts in Ukraine, the US government constantly talks about the idea of the so-called international community in scare quotes. And when it says that, it really means the US, Canada, Europe, and Australia and New Zealand. Maybe they'll throw in Japan and South Korea, but they ignore the vast majority of the global population, which is in the global south. And we see that same bias reflected in the Western media. And furthermore, when there is coverage of the Western media, there's often a kind of racist, patronizing perspective that portrays countries in the global south as authoritarian, in scare quotes, and portrays the West as supposedly democratic in counterbalance against the global south. And unfortunately, what it really shows is that despite the fact that these Western powers claim that they ended colonialism several decades ago, that colonialist mentality still very much lives on, especially in the media.
You know, we're living in the
So they're going to call that Chinese propaganda. As you saw, that is a Chinese news station funded by the Chinese government. So in America, it has this big warning bar going, you know, watch out, this is from the Chinese government. It's probably propaganda. And that's the problem. As a Latino who's worked with other Latinos and met other Latinos in other Latin American countries in activism, I could tell you that's exactly how Latin American people feel in America and in Latin America. But because the guy said it on Chinese news, it's got to be considered propaganda, although it's 100% true. So are the Chinese bringing this up in order to be kind and make sure the world's informed? No, obviously they're doing it for self-serving. But the problem is that even when the Chinese tell the truth, Americans just dismiss it as propaganda and not true, when it's 100% true. And that's the issue. The Chinese didn't have to come up with talking points against America all on their own. They just had to invite somebody who covers Latin American politics and tell the truth of how Latinos see it. And they said, this is pretty damning enough for America on its own, just to put on Chinese TV. But in the West, it's going to be called propaganda, when basically all Latinos know that's true. And China just said, we're going to put on people who say something we like hearing, but it's also true. But it'll be dismissed as propaganda. But that's how the world sees it. Let's do another one. So this is The Diplomat. The difference between America's two Cold Wars, insights from Alfredo Toro Hardy by Mercy A. Kuo, May 2nd, 2022. The Diplomat is a high-level public diplomacy magazine that covers like diplomatic affairs. Here we go. Incomprehensible under the light of common sense. George W. Bush proclaimed the futility of multilateral cooperation, which in his view constrained the freedom of action to which American power was entitled. This raw unilateralism gravely weakened a system that had served Washington exceedingly well while eroding the country standing within it. Bush, followed 8 years later up by Trump, was simply too much. The latter's dog-eat-dog approach to foreign policy ended up by shattering the trust in U.S. leadership. America's allies are finding it exceedingly difficult to tie their future to a country so prone to zigzags and extremes, particularly so as in a few years' time, Washington could be inaugurating a new Trump administration. So what the Diplomat's pointing out is that a lot of the reason that the world does not have faith in these international institutions is that America said they don't have faith in the international institutions. George W. Bush slammed international institutions as holding America back. Donald Trump did the same thing. That's two elected presidents in recent history in America saying, screw international alliances. Well, the rest of the world's watching that and going, hold on, you're saying we need to back up international alliances and buy what you're selling, but you have had two presidents who said maybe America shouldn't put much weight in international alliances recently? Are you really committed to international alliances? Because you've had people who come on and trash it, and then when you really want it, you come to us and go, well, it's really important we're all together. Well, then why'd you have these two presidents say that? Good point. Here's another point. Now, this is War in Ukraine and What It Means for the World Order by Ian Bremer for TED Talk. So this is a Western media source. Ian Bremer is a well-respected, well-known foreign policy scholar in America. Let me show you what he says.
Challenges are going to be filled with fossil fuels and fossil fuel development. And so I do think that the fact that both of the answers to your question are true in different places on net is more negative for how quickly we can transition.
Let's talk a bit about China. Birgit, I think, who's listening in, asks, what do you believe Xi Jinping is learning from the world's response to the crisis, to the Ukrainian war?
Well, certainly learning that this was a red line for the West. And I think that this would have surprised, it obviously surprised Putin. I think it would have surprised Xi Jinping as well. Xi Jinping saw Afghanistan. He saw that Merkel was out. He saw that Macron is focused on strategic autonomy. He sees Biden as much more focused on China and Asia. I think that this is a surprise to Xi Jinping. But Xi Jinping also sees that a lot of the world is not with NATO on this issue. 141 countries, if I remember correctly, voted to censor the Russians for their invasion of Ukraine at the United Nations General Assembly. But very large numbers of that 141 are not on board with all of these sanctions against Russia. They're happy with the diplomatic censure, but they need to continue to work with the Russians. The Chinese see that too. The Chinese see just how much more fragmented the global order is. I thought the most significant thing that we've seen from the Chinese so far, two issues. The first is, of course, when Putin went to Beijing and Xi Jinping.
So the point there was that here's an American policy scholar talking to a American-friendly audience and saying, and that's a 40-minute interview. And the point was about how Russia screwed up and they're stupid and bad and wrong, and they've ruined their international economic position and because of their stupidity. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. But wedged in there after 30 minutes of talking about Russia is this real quick little comment about, okay, how does China see that? And that's where he reveals, an American scholar to an American news-friendly agency, that China views the world after watching what happened to Russia as broken. There is no world order. There are poles, and they compete in two different ones. There is no combined, agreed world order, world discussion forum. It's split. And that's because a lot of people don't buy it as being fair. And China totally saw that. China's long felt that the UN, the IMF, is not fair. China's long talked about how America talks about an international rules-based order. And then they would say, but who got to make that order? Because it wasn't us. And that's a fair point. And now China's saying half the planet agrees with them. Half the planet has China's opinion on things. There is no agreed world order. It's fragmented because they don't believe it and trust it. All right, let's take another one. Here's some more evidence. Now, this is African news. This is out of Lagos, Nigeria. And so you're hearing the African perspective on the Ukraine war from an African news station and an African ambassador.
On the Security Council, when they believe that their interests are at stake. If the United, I remember very clearly synthesizing those views and arriving at a common position is very, very difficult, if not impossible. At the level of the United Nations, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is just the latest example. Down from 1945 to date, over the 70-odd years, we have seen the United Nations be ignored, be looked at as irrelevant by a group of hegemons, particularly those on the Security Council, when they believe that their interests are at stake. If the United, I remember very clearly when the United States was to go into Iraq, and the late General Powell, Colin Powell, went to the United Nations to try to persuade them to see what he was, or what the U.S. was talking about, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But they weren't convinced, and therefore the United Nations as a body didn't support that invasion. But the U.S. went ahead anyway, and almost 20 years later, the UN has been proved right. No weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq, in spite of everything that then subsequently happened. The same happened in Afghanistan when the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1979. The same happened when America went into Panama and Grenada, when Britain went into the Falklands before that. So we have a lot of examples of various countries, including those who should be leading, taking positions that do not support or that are not supported by the body. I guess the question then is, what is the relevance of these bodies, and why should one country belong to them if, when the chips are down, it cannot do anything practical about the situation?
Well, it's a clear case where you have a distinction between realism and idealism. The ideal situation is just what you've painted, having the UN live up to the vision of its founders. But the real situation is where big power politics determines what the UN does. The UN is as strong as the Security Council wants it to be. And if you notice where no Security Council member has interest, a crisis in any part of the world where no member of the Security Council has interest, the UN is very quick to resolve that crisis. But where the culprit is a member of the Security Council, it is difficult for the UN to have a say in how to resolve that conflict, essentially because of the use of the veto to make sure the UN is incapacitated. And that's exactly what happened in these instances you gave. Well, in spite of all this, the UN is still a relevant institution. Let's take the case of the Russian invasion. Yeah, the UN was not able to do anything because
there's another part I want you to see.
China and Russia will not want any other country that has sympathies for the West to be co-opted into the Council, aka Germany or Japan. The same way too, the current 3 members from the West, the US, Britain, and France, will likewise not want any country that has sympathy for these 2 other countries from the East becoming a member of the Security Council. So honestly, I don't see how we're going to reform the UN. We may be able to reform other bodies, but the Security Council is going to be a hard nut to crack. We just have to find a way to live with the current situation the way we have it. There's no way I think this body can be reformed.
So that was African news, right? And they're talking about, boy, what Russia did in Ukraine is bad. I remember this country called America, and they straight up lied to us at the UN, just like Russia. And then they caused an invasion, and they got 500,000 civilians killed, way more than Russia did. And so now America's saying, look at Russia. They're violating the UN. They're violating international protocols. They're invading countries. You did all the same stuff. And why aren't you bringing that up? That's what the African people were saying. And then the diplomats like, that's true. And on top of that, the UN Security Council is not fair. And so there's never really going to be any reform at the UN. And we're just going to have to deal with the broken institution that it is. That's an African diplomat going, yeah, it's not fair to us. And these big countries do whatever they want with us. And it's really a double standard. But we have nothing else. So I guess we'll just stick with it. That's the kind of enthusiasm they have for the international rules-based order, and you wonder why they don't come to America's support. All right, a few more examples. Here we go.
Does not inspire confidence. In Syria, they abandoned the Kurds. In Afghanistan, they abandoned, sort of like a tool to contain China. America's recent track record does not inspire confidence. In Syria, they abandoned the Kurds. In Afghanistan, they abandoned the Ashraf Ghani government. In Ukraine, they are cheering from the sidelines. Like I said, self-centered and volatile. Even their oldest ally, France, was not spared. And of course, talking about the AUKUS fiasco, America snatched away a submarine deal that was committed to France. What's worse, Paris was not even informed. Now, what does all of this indicate? Reliability issues. Partners who bet on US support are regretting it. The question is, will India be an exception? Frankly, it's hard to say. Do you remember this month's 2+2 dialogue between India and America? The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, decided to talk about India's human rights record. He said that he was tracking so-called concerning reports from India. Again, this was unsolicited. India did not ask for an assessment, yet Blinken decided to give one anyway. And now you have the American president using the same language. He is talking about quote-unquote problems with Indian democracy. Well, what about American democracy? Last year, there was an insurrection at the US Capitol. America's Congress was vandalized. Millions of Americans still believe that the 2020 election was rigged. Gun violence is uncontrolled system.
So that is Indian news talking about, okay, so the American Secretary of State slams us, saying we have these human rights violations. And then the President of America slams us, saying we're not really a functional democracy. You guys had a coup that almost overthrew your government. And half your country doesn't even believe in your elections. And you're going to criticize how democracy works in India? By the way, something they didn't even mention, Joe Biden has continued the Donald Trump policy of Latino kids in concentration camps. Children, brown skin, not white, not American, concentration camps. Continued under Biden. And then there was he refused to let refugees come in. And then there was the point where the Haitians came across the border and the border guards beat them. That's cool. That's not a human rights violation at all. Only India has problems and you don't have problems, America. This is what the Indians see. They're like, you suckered the Kurds. You know, you backed out on Afghanistan. You backed out in Syria on the Kurds. You tricked the French, your own close ally, on a major deal and snubbed them. And then your country has coups, and half the population doesn't accept the elections of a result, but you're the stable partner and we're the ones with problems. It's insulting. And they're kind of going, well, you know, you're no better than us. We're not saying we're perfect, but you're acting like you don't have any problems while criticizing us. Maybe you don't get that you have problems too. Maybe you think you're just better than us for no good reason. And maybe that's why you don't treat us fairly and never will. Indian news. All right, one more, and then we'll be done. Okay.
This is our top story at this hour. The United States doublespeak stands exposed as a report by a think tank suggests that the Biden government imported more oil from Moscow than New Delhi did amid the Ukraine-Russia war. India's decision to import oil from Russia had drawn sharp criticism from the West. From US to European leaders, the world had tried to corner India of its decision. But now the report from Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air has exposed their hypocrisy.
When it comes to oil purchases, sanctions, et cetera, I just note that there are carve-outs for energy purchases. Of course, we're encouraging countries not to purchase additional energy supplies from Russia. Every country is differently situated, has different needs, requirements, but we're looking to allies and partners not to increase their purchases of Russian energy.
By the organization shows a sharp rise in oil shipments to India and Egypt, which has grabbed a lot of eyeballs. However, the data goes on to show that Germany and Italy remain the top importers of Russian resources, even as the conflict started on February 24th. The statistics revealed by the think tank shows 71% of the total fossil fuel exports, including crude oil, piped gas, LNG, and coal, are exported to European countries. The Indian government has attributed its oil deal with the Kremlin to hefty discounts on crude oil that the country was getting, as the Russian government was reeling under strict sanctions.
So that's another Indian channel report saying, you're criticizing us, the West, in India. The West is criticizing India for buying Russian gas when you're saying to embargo them. And then you're saying we're bad people and we have human rights abuses and our democracy doesn't really function well. And you all said that right after we said we were going to continue to buy Russian gas. And so you're kind of pointing out that we're backwards and not as good as you as a way of guilt tripping us into backing your stance against Russia. Well, here's the thing. You lied. You said India, you're a bad person for backing Russia and buying their gas. Why aren't you with us in the West? While you still bought their oil and gas, and you bought more of their oil and gas than we in India did while criticizing us in India. I mean, that's horrible. So I've shown you how people in Africa look at this. I've shown you how people in India look at this. I've shown you some American scholars who back up that thing. And all of it is showing a divided world with no consensus, because nobody buys the West as a fair partner, and they think they're hypocrites. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that, as we just went over, which means we'll need a new negotiation center, world discussion center. And I would argue that could be California, because it's just not working anymore. And I predicted this in my book in 2012. The global discussion centers were built for people whose minds were in the 1950s, when the world was largely controlled by white people. That is no longer the case. You know, in the 50s, when they built the IMF, World Bank, and even the 90s, when they were talking about the International Criminal Court, you could still say it was mostly the West that's in power. Now it's 2020. Brazil's a major power. India's a rising superpower. China's a rising superpower. Russia's still a power. Mexico's coming up. Indonesia's coming up. South Africa's coming up. Argentina's coming up. And none of these countries are in the West. And they were not involved heavily in the creation of the ICC, the IMF, the UN, or the World Bank. And they're still not in the driver's seat for most of those institutions. And so they don't see them as fair. And we saw that in wide display with the vote on banning Russia from the Human Rights Council in the UN. And that shocked the West, which only proves something. The West has absolutely no idea how unfair they're treating the rest of the world and how bigoted and hypocritical they look. California could step in and become the World Negotiation Center. Why? Because we already did it once. Climate change was because of us. The UN couldn't handle climate change. It wasn't able to get discussions off the ground. We did it under Governor Schwarzenegger all by ourselves. We invited 20 to 40 different nations here, held conferences here in California, developed the legislation, and moved on it. And we did such a good job that the UN President Ban Ki-moon said, why don't you, Governor Schwarzenegger in California, keep up the discussion on how to deal with climate change for the planet? So the World Discussion Forum said, you're doing a better job dealing with this world issue than we are. Why don't you keep it up? That was around 2005 that happened. We also have the governor of California, when he was mayor of San Francisco in 2009, right after the UN said this about California climate change. Hint, hint, maybe it influenced the governor, then mayor of San Francisco's thinking, that there be a UN sub-center in San Francisco. San Francisco was the original first location of the United Nations. And the governor proposed the UN come back to San Francisco. There are not one, but 4 United Nations offices in Kenya and Austria and Switzerland and New York City. So there certainly could be a 5th one in California. We covered that in the first part. There isn't just one office. There could be a 5th one. If Switzerland gets one, and they were really fit for the diversity of global powers 100 years ago, why can't we have one when we are the only place on the earth fit for the distribution of global powers today? That was the major thing that I found in my book. Show me another place with a significant Chinese population, Russian population, Latino population, European population, Indian population, and American population. Outside of California, it doesn't exist. Well, thank you. That has been part 2. I think I showed you a fair amount of reasons why the world does not buy the current discussion centers there. California could be the new World Discussion Center, but in order to do that well, it would need to become an independent and neutral nation. This is another reason why California should be independent.